Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Cynthia Wesley Esquimaux, the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University. Welcome, Cynthia.
Well, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Let's start just giving us a little bit of background, some of your personal history. Where did you grow up, and maybe a bit about your education?
I grew up in Toronto. Both my parents were residential school survivors. They went to the Shingwalk residential school in Sault Ste. Marie. And most of the people, when they left residential school, didn't go back to their home communities. Most of them went to urban centers because when they did try to go home, there wasn't maybe much there for them, or they had been away from their family so long that they didn't really feel like a part of those families. Mm-hmm. In some instances, like my mom's, her dad had died, and she just, I think, felt a little displaced. Mm-hmm. So she went to the city. So I was actually born in Toronto and raised there, and spent a lot of time on northern communities because, again, because they went to residential school, they knew a lot of people from different communities. So I've spent a lot of time moving around to different reserves, visiting with people all the time. So I got an opportunity to see many of them. I dropped out of school at 16, a lot of it because of racism and some of the commentary that I encountered there. I went to work at an insurance company downtown Toronto, and then when I was 20, I moved to Southern California and lived in Palm Springs for 5 years, which was a very good decision. And I learned there that what was going on around me wasn't necessarily about me as it was about the environment in which I was living. Mm-hmm. Because the environment in Southern California was very different. So that was a very big gift, I think, for me to have acquired.
And a lot of us get stuck in thinking it's all about me, but really we're just a small player in the big scheme of things. A small player in the big, yes, on the big stage of life. So when I came back, and the reason I came back is I went to College of the Desert, and I graduated from Palm Springs High. And then I went to College of the Desert, and I realized I can do this. So I applied to the University of Toronto and came back to go to school at U of T. So I finished my undergraduate degree at U of T, and I worked in the Indigenous community for the next 12 to 14 years in self-government and land claims coordination and in community and personal development work. And then I went back to graduate school because I really wanted to understand what was happening and why were people struggling so much in our communities. Mm-hmm. And so I went back to do a master's degree and then continued on to a doctorate. So I have a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Toronto. Well, all my degrees are from the University of Toronto. And then I have been, subsequent to that, a professor. I've taught everything but anthropology. I've taught political science, I've taught history, I've taught social work, I've taught Aboriginal studies. I have never taught anthropology. And since then, I moved up to Thunder Bay. I've been in Thunder Bay for 3.5 years. And I was the Vice Provost Aboriginal Initiatives at Lakehead, and have been moved to a chair on Truth and Reconciliation effective mid-September. So what prompted the move to Thunder Bay? Well,
I did my doctoral work in Anishinaabe. So I spent a year up in one of the remote communities looking at the effects of the unresolved intergenerational grief and trauma on Indigenous populations. So because my master's degree was on a comparative analysis of the aftermath of the bubonic plagues in Europe and the aftermath of the epidemics on this continent. So from there I went to the next level and said, so what does the intergenerational effect look like? And what if it isn't resolved? What if we are still grieving? What if we're still suffering from those traumas? What does it look like today? And I think what you see happening in communities in a lot of instances is exactly what that resonance is that we have not resolved a lot of the outstanding grief and trauma, historic grief and trauma, and we still are feeling it today. So that's the piece that we're working on now.
So, Lakehead University, did they just create a new position?
Yeah.
So that's the chair for Truth and Reconciliation.
The first in Canada. So
the first in Canada. Yeah, I saw that in the paper,
yeah.
And the Minister of Indigenous Affairs was here to make that announcement a month and a half ago.
It's September, mid-September. I think it was September 19th, something like that.
So
yeah.
Going on 3 months now.
Yeah.
And so there's some history about the creation of that position, which I guess goes back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Tell us a little bit about that event and experience.
Well, I have done probably reconciliation work most of my life. It's just that I have, I think, a real sense of peacemaking and being sort of that bridge between different peoples and sort of an interpreter in the middle. You know, whether it's English to English is not the point. It's sometimes culture to culture, and sometimes it's about perceptions to perceptions. So trying to help people understand each other has probably been one of the most important things I've done in my lifetime. And when it came to Lakehead, working with the Indigenous community and also continuing the work that I'd been doing anyway across the board, I saw that there was a strong need for reconciliation here, and we are having those conversations. I work with M&R, I work with a lot of the people across the police, different people who are actually interested in also doing reconciliation work. The reason we actually can turn my position over to a chair was because I'm also doing work with the Ministry of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada on child welfare. So to make it possible for me to do both and not be in an administrative role, which requires, of course, that you are present on a regular basis and managing staff and attending meetings, and so it's more of an internal function. They said, well, let's make this chair, and then that way you can continue to do the external work that you're doing for the university and bringing in interests from across Canada and actually taking out our interests across Canada and speaking about what Lakehead is doing to work more effectively with the Indigenous population.
So you're kind of like an ambassador.
Yeah, in many ways, yes. It is an ambassador position. I have the responsibility of opening up those conversations and being a part of those conversations on an ongoing basis. So we sit down with a group who is working on a particular issue, and then we continue to meet and find ways to create some conciliation or reconciliation around that issue.
And so it's both internal to the university as well as the external environment. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Well, so internally, yes. So internally, that Lakehead has done the Indigenous content requirement, right? Indigenous.
Well, tell us about that.
So Lakehead has been working for before I came along. Actually, we're working on an Indigenous content requirement for all students at Lakehead would get some measure of Indigenous content and knowledge in their curriculum before they graduated. And they've been working on that and actually talking to all of the faculties and looking at all of the curriculum, looking at all the programming and saying, okay, what are we doing now? Where do we have to build it up, and where do we need to ensure that we create a new program, or whatever we need to do? We've been looking at that. And part of that process is actually also helping the faculty and staff understand why it's important, and the students, right? So there's a reconciliation piece there. So today at Lakehead, I met with the staff. They had a staff retreat, a lot of staff across Lakehead, and we talked about the 94 calls to action. And we did an activity that helped them understand what those calls to action are about. And they had to take one call to action and say, yes, this is why it should happen, and another call to action and say, this is why it shouldn't happen, because not everybody necessarily agrees that the calls to action are important. So you should know how to argue both sides of that equation. And then in the afternoon, we did the girls did a blanket exercise, a Kairos blanket exercise with the staff to also show them how the history of the country has evolved around the indigenous peoples and in colonialism. Those are internal reconciliation processes. On an external level,
maybe hang on there.
Okay.
We're just about out of time. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.